Hello, everybody. Welcome to this ClimateCamp webinar, where we're going to talk about getting started with product carbon footprints. Now, before we get started, I want to ask you the question if you can hear me properly, if you can see me properly, and if you can see my colleague Ruben as well. There is a chat on top, which you can click on, and you can always note down there if you can see and hear us properly. So I don't start talking and you don't hear us properly. As there is no responses quite yet, I am assuming that everything is coming across properly. All right, perfect. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this ClimateCamp webinar on getting started with product carbon footprint. Now, it has been a while since we organized a webinar. It was before my time, but I wanted to kick off the tradition once again, so we could provide some more education, some more content when it comes to carbon calculation, when it comes to supplier engagement, and all topics related to carbon reduction. Now, today we're talking about product carbon footprints. But when I say we, I want to say I'm joined here today with Ruben. Ruben is our head of customer success and is also one of the co-founders of ClimateCamp. So he'll have quite some insights, especially into the product itself, to share with us. And I am Maarten de Kroos. I am the marketing lead for ClimateCamp, and I will be directing you through PCF today. Now, before we get started, let's go over what we are going to discuss today. This is the agenda for today. So first, we're going to focus on what is product carbon footprint. We'll look a bit at the theory, at the broad view on product carbon footprint. We'll dive a bit deeper on the relationship between corporate carbon footprints and product carbon footprints, as well as go into an example that showcases how the granularity of actions you can take when it comes to carbon reduction differs when looking at corporate carbon footprint and product carbon footprint. Then we'll move on to how to actually calculate product carbon footprint. We'll go over the broad theory. How do you define system boundaries? How do you define the production processes? How do you map processes? And then how you start calculating product carbon footprints? How do you do allocation and the different methods related to PCF calculation? And then I will hand the mic over to Ruben, who will take us through the product and do a short PCF calculation in ClimateCamp itself. Then afterwards, we're going to quickly touch on how do I collect and share PCF data, because PCF data, calculating it is all good and well, but if you don't share it with your customers or if you don't collect it to improve your data granularity, there is not much use to calculating PCF if you don't use it. And then we'll move on to the Q&A section, where you can ask questions from me or Ruben with regards to the platform, with regards to PCF, or if you have different opinions on how certain calculations are done. I do want to ask you before we move on, you are all muted and the cameras are off. So if you have questions, there is a chat and a Q&A section. The Q&A section, you can enter, you can enter your question and then we can pick it up at the end. You can also paste it on chat, but for us, it's a lot easier if you do it on Q&A. So let's get started. Now, what is a product carbon footprint? Before we move into product carbon footprint, we have to talk about its big brother, corporate carbon footprint, or the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced by a company's operations, supply chains, products, and services. And this includes direct and indirect emissions across 3 scopes. Now, I checked the people who are registered for this webinar and how your companies are dealing with this topic. I'm assuming that for a lot of you, corporate carbon footprint is already something you understand, something you have done a first calculation. Maybe you did scope 1 and 2 calculation. Maybe you did scope 3 calculation using industry averages already. So this webinar is not corporate carbon footprint, but it is important to understand the relationship between corporate carbon footprint and product carbon footprint. Where corporate carbon footprint looks at the entire organization, a product carbon footprint will just take the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but take it throughout one product's life cycle, from raw material extraction through manufacturing, transportation, usage, and disposal. So if you then look towards the relationship between product carbon footprint and corporate carbon footprint, everything here in blue represents your corporate carbon footprint. This is an image straight from the GHG protocol, where you can see all the emissions related to your upstream activities, your direct emissions from scope 1 and 2, as well as your downstream scope 3 emissions. If you then look at the green bar, this is what one product represents among your entire corporate carbon footprint. So the PCF represents all the emissions generated from one products. The less products you have, the more your PCF will come closer to your corporate carbon footprint. But if you have, like many companies, 10, 20, 30 different types of products, they will have varying impacts on the amount of emissions they generate, depending on the raw materials they comprise of or the complexity of their value chain. Now, when we talk about product carbon footprint, you have to ask yourself the question, when do I calculate the PCF, right? At what point is it necessary for me to do PCF calculation? Well, when we at ClimateCamp talk about developing carbon maturity or becoming more carbon mature as a company, we always go through these 4 steps. For most companies, it all starts with calculation for scope 1 and 2, maybe doing some energy optimization related to scope 1 and 2, and then moving towards corporate carbon footprint, scope 3, using emission factors or industry averages. This is where most companies start out, and then you can directly start moving into calculating product carbon footprint using emission factors. But what we generally advise is that you start engaging your suppliers, that you start gathering primary data from your suppliers, so you can use that to adjust your scope 3 with primary data to improve its accuracy and to calculate product carbon footprint with primary data. Why is this important? I recently saw the example, if you source aluminium from Iceland or you source it from Africa, it can change up to 6 or 7 times the amount of emissions you are buying, depending on which supplier or which country you are getting it from. Then after you engage with your suppliers, you start with goal setting. Now, step 2 and 3 are often done in parallel. These are not sequential all the time. So when you set reduction goals such as SBTI or similar, you need corporate carbon footprint, and one of the actions is often related to supplier engagement. So step 2 and 3 often happen in parallel. Then you start with reduction actions, launch value chain reduction initiatives, improve product design, source sustainable goods, improve the circularity, the end of use of your product, the way it can be recycled and extend its lifetime. Then you launch specific actions based on the 3 steps before. From the information you gained in the first 3 steps, you will launch much more targeted reduction initiatives. Well, let's have an example of PCF versus CCF and what the specificity of reduction actions can be. So if you take a look at this, I saw there were some packaging companies registered for this webinar. So suppose we have a mid-sized packaging manufacturer and we do a corporate carbon footprint calculation. And this is a very simple example because if I have to do a very accurate one, this webinar will take 5 hours. But let's say their emissions are divided between 65% comes from scope 3, purchase goods and services. So they buy plastics and they buy paperboard. They spend 20% of their emissions on electricity use to process their goods. And 15% is spent on transportation, employee commute, and business travel. When looking at these numbers, we can say, okay, the primary actions should be engage your suppliers to gather primary data and to see where reduction opportunities can arise, improve your energy mix or the purchasing of what energy you do for the electricity use at your factories. And maybe there are better ways to improve the transportation usage, like improve or optimize transportation routes, get people to use electric cars or reduce business travel, for example. As you can see, corporate carbon footprint is very broad, very general. It's also used for regulations such as CSRD or for SBTI. It's very broad and it entails also very broad actions. But if we then move towards product carbon footprint, we see this packaging company makes 2 products. They make a plastic tray, which has a much higher PCF because it uses plastics, which is fossil-based, and it uses energy-intensive mold. It also has product B, a paper-based cup with bioplastic lining. This has lower PCF, but they need to source the bioplastic from, let's say, from China. Now, we had the actions before which relate to corporate carbon footprint, which were very broad. Here we can see, okay, maybe for product A, we should be able to switch materials. Maybe we can switch the plastics, make sure it lasts longer, it's more sturdy, and that could significantly reduce emissions. And maybe for product B, there is an alternative route to source bioplastic more locally or less far away. This is the difference between getting more specific on reduction initiatives and using product carbon footprint to do optimizations on a product level. Now, this was a bit the general introduction to product carbon footprint. Now we want to go into the specifics of how do I calculate a product carbon footprint. And it all starts with defining the system boundaries. And the system boundaries are related to what you are trying to achieve. I think for most people in supply chain or in manufacturing, this graph of cradle to gate to grave is not unfamiliar, where you have raw materials which are sourced, they then get transported to a pre-processing plant or to a manufacturing step, then they get distributed towards the customers, they get used and the products get reused or recycled. Now, when we do PCF calculations, you need to ask yourself the question, what is the goal with the PCF I am trying to calculate? If the goal is to share PCF data with your customers who are asking for it, you should use cradle to gate. So from the raw material sourcing up until the point where your factory does its manufacturing or processing, for example. Why? This will avoid double counting if people at later stages do PCF calculations as well. So it will improve the accuracy of the PCF. If you do cradle to grave, well, you can do cradle to grave, but it has a different application. You can do it to improve product design, to think about how we can improve end of life, how we can increase recycle percentage. But you can also apply cradle to grave in sectors who have end-to-end involvement in the value chain, let's say car manufacturers, for example, or heating or ventilation products. You can also do a gate-to-gate PCF calculation. This has more to do with optimizing your in-house processes and your operational flows on your sites. After you define system boundaries, so for this example, we'll use cradle to gate because we want to share our PCF data with our customers. You need to think about what are the different production steps that my product goes through up until it arrives at my factory and we do our processing there. So you have raw material extraction, mining or farming are the primary ones here. You have material processing, manufacturing, and assembly, where the raw materials get processed, get formed into new products, and then get shipped off towards customers. Then they get distributed towards the customers. Then you have use phase, how the product is used, and then end of life management. Obviously, this is a very simple representation of the value chain. You often have multiple processing steps, manufacturing steps, transportation between the different steps as well. But when you want to calculate PCF, it's good to make a visual overview of all the different production steps which happen in the creation of your products. Once you have these production steps, you start with mapping the production process. Now, ClimateCamp has a lot of breweries and customers in the beer sector, so I used beer making or beer brewing as an example here. Where you can see we listed all the different production steps, raw material sourcing, transportation towards the brewery, the malting process, brewing process, and the packaging process. And then for each of these steps or each of these production steps, we define what goes in, what's the input, what process happens, and what is the outputs. Why do we want to have this structured overview? So we can go step by step and decide what are emission sources related to this process. So in raw material sourcing, you might use fertilizer for the barley and the hops. You will use diesel to harvest, for example, these crops, and you use land, obviously, to host where you are setting these crops. So, and then transport, malting, brewing, you will go through every step and look at the different things that happen and define this is the emission source related to this specific process. This will help you with allocating emission factors at a later stage. Now you know the system boundaries, you know we do cradle to gate calculation to share PCF with our customer. You have an idea of the production steps and the different inputs and outputs, so you can allocate emission sources at the next step. Now, how do I calculate a product carbon footprint? To calculate it, you need to calculate emissions for each of these processes separately and select the best allocation methods. You then gather the necessary emission factors or use primary data, suppose that you have engaged with your suppliers, and then you add everything together. How does this allocation work? Well, for each process, you need to define how much of this process was allocated to a certain product. The best way is obviously when an entire process is allocated to only one product. If you have a machine or you have a factory which only is focused on generating or creating or processing one product, then no allocation needs to happen because everything is allocated to that single product. But that is often not what happens because in many different manufacturing environments, there are certain steps where multiple products pass through. Is it transportation? Is it a certain processing step? So then you need to use a fallback allocation method, which can be one of three things. You can use mass, so the certain weight for raw materials, for example, the weight of different products that pass through a certain step. You can use an economic allocation, so the costs, financial costs, the cost procurement. You can use procurement data for that, sales data for that. Or you use a physical units, such as energy or volume content. These are different types of allocation methods which you can use for each step, each production step in your PCF calculation. I'll create two examples so this becomes more clear because it's a lot of theory. It's a lot easier to understand if you have a specific example. So let's say we have the energy allocation for brewing of the beer. So we know our brewery's total energy use for the brewing process was 12,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Now we create two beers. We have an IPA and a stout. The stout has a much longer fermentation time, so it uses much more energy. The IPA uses 45%, the stout uses 55%. Then I also added the amount of liters they brewed during this process. Now, to allocate emissions, it's pretty straightforward. We have the energy distribution, so we can say 45% of the 12,000 kilos is 5,500 kilos CO2 equivalent, and for stout, it is 6,600 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. We then calculate the PCF per liter for electricity use, for the electricity we use to brew these two beers. We can then say IPA is 5,400 kilos divided by the 20,000 liters, and for stout, it's 6,600 kilograms divided by the 10,000 liters, which leads up to 0.27 kilograms CO2 equivalent per liter for the IPA and 0.66 for the stouts. Now, this is obvious because the stout has much less liters brewed and it uses much more energy. So this is a pretty straightforward example. Now, the second example I wanted to give is when you use mass, for example, when you try to do PCF calculation for the raw material sourcing. I've used the same IPA and stout example here, where they have exactly the similar profiles, except when it comes to barley. The IPA only uses 200 grams of malted barley, whereas the Imperial Stout uses 250 grams of malted barley and 50 grams of roasted barley. Now, we made it as simple as possible, so all the emission factors for water and the weights that are used are the same to make it easy to compare. But here you can see when we apply the emission factor for malted barley on 200 grams, we come up with 0.08 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for the IPA. And when we look at the stout, we have 0.10 kilograms for the malted barley and 0.025 kilograms for the roasted barley. If we add everything up, we see the difference in product carbon footprint for these two products is 0.11 versus 0.155 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which is not surprising seeing as we use much more goods to calculate the raw materials for the stouts. And then we'll move into a short demo of how we calculate PCF in ClimateCamp. And then I will give the mic over to my colleague Ruben, who will take you through.
Thanks a lot, Maarten, for this in-depth insights in the differentiations of product carbon footprint, corporate carbon footprint, cradle to gate, cradle to grave, and then also the in-practice example. I'll be happy to now show how this looks in practice in ClimateCamp as well. So if you could give me a quick thumbs up if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So as Maarten indicated, as a first step, it's very important to describe the different process steps within the PCF calculations. So in this case, I quickly set up a cradle to gate example. And I saw a comment about this as well. I think it was a legit comment. So when we use PCFs for carbon accounting purposes, as most of you will know, usually these PCFs, if they then are used as emission factors, will contribute to the purchase goods and services aspect, where in the corporate carbon footprint, we have additional GHG categories like end of life, waste, and so on, which use of sold products, which are different emission factors. So it's very important to differentiate these cradle to gate, cradle to grave when sharing PCFs. However, as every production process is unique, it's actually in ClimateCamp possible for any customer to customize this production process themselves, or also to add additional life cycle stages to the PCF calculation. So as you can see here, I have set up Maarten's IPA, and I defined different steps like the raw materials, packaging, upstream transportation, processing, which I split into electricity and gas. And I would be able to add additional steps. For example, let's say that I want to include end of life as well in the calculation. I would be able to add an additional group, which will then also be added to the total process of this product carbon footprint. So here we define the different process steps of the product carbon footprint. If we then go to the activity step, that's actually the place where it is possible to allocate the different activities to each process step. So in this example, for the raw materials, I added an activity roasted malt and sugar. For the packaging, I indicated it's brewed into bottles. Transportation, I indicated the transport for malt and sugar based on the location where it's coming from. And then for the processing, I added some electricity consumption and gas consumption. You will see here that I did not upload the data for a specific declared unit. So the declared unit here is actually a brewing session because I do not know for a specific bottle, let's say 33 centiliters, how much malt I have used or sugar I have used. No, I used a bill of material, which I only have for 1,000,000 bottles. That's why here it's not for one specific bottle, but we will allocate them later based on the 1,000,000 bottles. We can then divide the total emissions to get the emissions for one specific bottle. So how does it work in practice? I have here Maarten's IPA. I can then add activities to each process step. So how does that work? I can add an activity by selecting first the activities or the process step. Let's say, for example, raw materials. And for this stout or for this IPA, I did not only use traditional malt, but actually part of the malt that I use is regenerative malt. So I give it an activity name. If wanted, I can add a relevant activity ID, a code, a supplier. In this case, for example, I bought this from a specific supplier, so I'll add them here. I can indicate the quantity. Let's say that I added X amount of tons of malt in this brew. In case that it's, you can see that we support different units and it is possible to add specific conversion factors as well. Note that each period will have also a specific, or each PCF is relevant for a specific period. So it could be, for example, that the PCF will change over the years. So therefore, it's always very important to indicate the period for which this PCF or this activity is applicable. So in this case, I take 2024, and then it's possible to save the activity. If we save the activity like this, what will happen is that the ClimateCamp team will take on the emission factor allocation on their side. So there are a lot of emission factors available within the ClimateCamp platform, but we also support our customers in selecting these right emission factors if they would not be able to do it themselves. Next to that, if they are able to do it themselves, they could actually indicate that they want to allocate emission factors themselves, where it is possible to choose an industry emission factor, which is then based on, for example, an eco-event, an ADEM, Agribalise. So different databases are available within ClimateCamp to be able to select. So I would say, okay, for malt, which are the emission factors by default available, I see here that I have malted barley with the source, also a short description, so where this is coming from, and we'll be able to select this emission factor. As you can see, there's also some flag emissions applicable to this emission factor, so this would be displayed as well. So this would allow me to calculate the emissions for this specific activity. An important thing, and what's very unique about ClimateCamp, is that it would be possible to use also supplier-specific information. So in this case, Chocolate Factory, of course, it's not a chocolate factory, but Stan's Factory has provided primary data, and I can actually see that they have both regenerative malt as roasted malt emission factors available. So in this case, as the regenerative malt has been used, I will be able to select that, and it would then also leverage actually the primary data of that supplier, which in this case is actually what we see quite a bit lower than the traditional emission factor in an eco event. If I would take a roasted malt, for example, this is the traditional malt, we see actually that the emission factor in reality in Stan's Factory is higher than the industry average emission factor. So that's a bit where we see the differentiation between using the primary data from the supplier, where we get, okay, what's the real actual PCF, the real emissions that were generated during the production of this roasted malt, or in this case, maybe a more sustainable alternative to regenerative malt compared to the industry average emission factor. If I would then save, this activity would end up in the list and then would be added to the total. I think it's interesting to also take a quick look towards the electricity. For example, if you look at electricity and gas, there the calculations actually happen fully automated. So that's also why I will be asked here, this data is auto-generated. Are you sure you want to make edits to this? In this case, I do think that I know what I'm doing. So I think for this gas consumption that has been allocated, I would be able to see the emission factor that has been automatically assigned. So when it comes to energy calculation for gas, electricity, fossil fuels in mobile combustion, for example, there the emission factor will be automatically assigned with the relevant source to them as well. So it's a fully automated process when it comes to the emission factor allocation for purchases that have been done, for example, a purchased good. In those cases, it is or up to the customer or up to ClimateCamp to allocate the right emission factor. It's maybe also interesting to see that also for electricity, there, of course, we take into account the grid mix of purchased electricity and differentiate there also on the product carbon footprint level between the location-based and market-based emissions. So yeah, that was a bit of a high-level overview on how this works. As you can see, it is possible to add as much activities as wanted or which are applicable for this PCF, as long as they, of course, fit within the right process steps within the calculation.
All right, thank you, Ruben, for this short explanation. So as we mentioned before, in the PCF calculation, when we do it in ClimateCamp, in this example, it was for a certain brew. So this will be a certain amount of hectoliters. So the PCF value then still needs to be divided. We have a way of doing that in the ClimateCamp platform as well, to divide it then according to the production volume. But keep in mind, you're not always going to dial it down to the bottle or to a specific unit. It might be in a larger volume that you calculate certain PCFs. Now, I want to remind people, if they have questions regarding PCF or how it is done in ClimateCamp, please do ask them in the chat or in Q&A so we can answer them in a couple of minutes. The last thing I want to focus on, I'll just quickly share my screen again. The last thing I want to focus on is how do you collect corporate carbon footprint and product carbon footprint data from your value chain. Where I started in the beginning with saying it's nice to calculate a PCF, but it needs to have a goal. If you do cradle to gate PCF calculations, for example, the goal is to share it with your customers. But when we look at it the other way around, when you want primary data as to make sure your corporate carbon footprint scope 3 calculations, as well as your product carbon footprint calculations are as accurate as possible, then you need to start engaging your value chain. Not only for product carbon footprints, if you want to do SBTI and you want to follow up on the target setting, your suppliers do what scope 1, 2, 3 data they have as well. You will have to engage with them just in the same way. Now, when we do collecting of CCF and PCF data, it's not just sending a questionnaire and people will fill it in and the problem is solved. We would like to think that that is how it is done. But if that were the case, then we wouldn't need to spend so much effort in collecting this data. Now, when you try to talk to your value chain, and especially your suppliers, there are two main steps which we at ClimateCamp often go through to help them deliver this data. First, we need to help them onboard whatever information they have. We have a supplier list, but we need to screen it and we need to improve it, because first we take a look at, let's say you have 100% of emissions coming from your suppliers, and from this 100%, you want to have the suppliers responsible for 80% of total emissions. So you then need to segment that list based on that 80%. You also need to improve it. A lot of these lists in procurement tools or in ERP tools are info ops, are maybe the salesperson who does not have any idea about sustainability information. So there are certain processing steps which need to happen before you can start with engagements. We then pre-fill publicly available information, because larger companies often have sustainability reports, which we can then use the information which is on that report for corporate carbon footprint, for example, and then you send the questionnaire. But as I mentioned before, you send this questionnaire, if you have 100 suppliers, you should be glad if 10 respond or 15 respond, because often it takes a lot of mailing, calling, following up, because these people are busy, they don't always have the data, and you want to help them, you want to hold their hands to set a meeting to gather this information. Then you need to also provide proper information. PCF, CCF, target setting, it's not easy to understand. There is a lot of nuance, there's a lot of context which needs to get communicated. So if you just hire an intern who only knows about this topic for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and then needs to explain it to people who are in packaging for the last 10 years, it might not go as well as you might think. And then obviously you need to validate that and check the assurance, the limited or reasonable assurance of this data, because they can otherwise use whatever data they want to transmit to you. And if you want to report on it, you want to make sure that certain data has been audited and that you are sure that it is correct. Now, this is the part when they actually have data, when they actually are able to share something with you. But the reality is that a lot of your value chain is maybe smaller companies. They may not have PCF data. They may not have CCF data at this time. So you will need to help them along. A lot of players in the sector, a lot of players in sustainability are helping to educate their value chain and to move their maturity level along. I mentioned in the beginning, you have a maturity level when it comes to carbon. You start with corporate carbon footprint, you then move to PCF for supplier engagement, you start goal setting. The same thing applies here. When you do supplier engagement, you need to assess maturity level of all your suppliers. Some will be very, very advanced, some will hardly have calculated scope 1 and 2. Then when you have this maturity level, you know what types of tools, content, documentation, and especially hand-holding you will need to do to get certain scope 1, 2, 3 data, targets, PCF data, or more granular information, such as, for example, water usage or other metrics related to your products. You will then need to handhold them to input the data because this is very new to them and help increase their maturity over time. So as we move towards 2030, 2050, these low maturity companies start delivering more data and more accurate data. Now, this entire process requires skilled professionals, automation, best practices, and a secure data exchange platform. This is not only to sell ClimateCamp or to convince you why ClimateCamp is really good at this, but it takes a lot more than people often think. We have talked to dozens of different companies who are like, oh, we've started this process. We think we can handle it ourselves. And then 3 people answer the questionnaire, and that's all the PCF or CCF data they receive. And sustainability professionals are already over questioned for doing a lot of different tasks. They have a lot of responsibilities. So it's not always easy to do this manual follow-up of retrieving the CCF and PCF data. So if you're interested in exploring how you can collect it from your value chain, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. Now, this is the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank you for joining us, but primarily I want to focus on the Q&A because I saw there were some questions in the chat, which I wanted to focus on. The first one, let me quickly see, is how to decide which allocation method is most suitable for your products. Maybe Ruben can begin here as well, but it all depends on the available data you have and obviously what type of process it is. Every business differs in the type of products they create. So if it's a machine which does the process, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, this will help determine which allocation method is best suited to calculate emissions.
And I think my answer is aligned with yours, Maarten. At ClimateCamp, we always start from what data that is available. So we will look, okay, which data points are available at the customer side to use in this. So per processing step, which data points can we leverage to do the calculations? Usually then we will do a first estimation based on the average emission factors, and we'll immediately see some carbon hotspots. Within the product carbon footprint, you might have, for example, for beer, a very big impact will be the packaging the malt will be very important. So in those cases, it will be important that if we use an allocation or an allocation method which is not that accurate, we will know, okay, it has a significant impact on the total carbon footprint of that product. In those cases, we say, okay, that might be worth to dig a bit deeper and get more accurate insights into the allocation or into the exact activity. It will be also for those aspects or for those components that it will be more important to use primary data from suppliers as well. So if we see, for example, okay, malt represents around 7% of the total footprint of that specific beer, we will then say like, okay, we use an industry average emission factor based on the total weight of malt that has been used within this production batch. But as it has such a significant impact, we would like to go even a step further and work together with the supplier to get primary data for the malt used within this batch. Even there, if we see that the supplier is not able, and that's what we see actually very often with our customers, is when they do a calculation on a product carbon footprint level or on a corporate carbon footprint level, if the supplier is not able to provide these PCFs, which is very often the case, and it's normal, it's a fast evolving market where a lot of PCFs still need to be generated. That's actually one of the core things that ClimateCamp helps with. If there is no data, to make sure that we can help suppliers to give the right context, the right tools, be it with ClimateCamp or be it with an Excel tool or another platform. For us, it's not that important how it happens. The most important is that there is an accurate, trustworthy PCF provided for these components that pop up in the hotspot analysis of being very important or have an important contribution to the product carbon footprint. So long answer, if I would do it short, depends on the data that is available and on the hotspot analysis for the higher impactful products. There we go the extra mile to get more precise PCF or more precise allocation or PCF information.
Okay, thank you, Ruben. I'll then directly dive into the next question. But I'll also let Ruben answer when it comes to how long does it actually take to perform one PCF. For example, in this case of beer, well, the first thing I'm going to answer before I let Ruben answer is this obviously very much depends on how complex your product is, how much data you have available. Beer is much more simple than maybe a machine that has 100 components and that has a lot of different materials and processing steps. So it really depends on that. But if we have the data available, if you have a good understanding, then it will go a lot quicker. Obviously, Ruben, you did PCF for beers, or you were involved in calculations regarding this case. Can you give a bit more explanation?
Yeah, as Martin indicated, there's not like I'll give one anyway at the end, but just to put like some disclaimers, it depends a lot on the complexity of the product. Are we doing, what's the scope? Do we do cradle to gate or cradle to grave? How evolved is the industry? Let's say we do a cradle to grave, for example, and the use, the product usage is there's not much documentation about that available. So there's a lot of variables that contribute to that. What we see is that what I can say is that from the moment that we receive the data points, so be it bill of material, allocation of energy, and know where these bill of material, these products for a cradle to gate, for example, where these products are coming from, then yeah, it's a matter of doing the emission factor allocation. So within 2 weeks, you will have your totally calculated PCF from the moment that we get the right data points. What we see very often is that it takes a while just to put in the right context. This first PCF, we do a lot of hand holding still, where it's needed to indicate what are the different process steps that we will include, what are the data points needed, how can these be provided. So we'll see that sometimes it takes a bit more time to gather and get all the right data input into ClimateCamp. Once this first PCF has been calculated, then of course all the PCFs that follow will go way faster. The customer will really understand which data points are needed, where they can find them in the organization, how these can be uploaded in ClimateCamp. So then this data gathering part can be reduced, and then we can see that up to the first within 2 weeks, as you have seen, energy calculations are done automatically. So that's within 5 minutes you will have those calculated. When it comes to the raw materials, yeah, we still have a part of automation, but we still have an in-house expert who does nothing but emission factor allocation. We'll need to free up his time. So usually he has 2 weeks to assign the right emission factors for these different material components. That being said, we also see the PCF as, okay, we do a one-time calculation, but as indicated before, that will give us a hotspot analysis. And then we know, okay, these are the hotspots within this product carbon footprint. Then of course, in parallel, usually the supplier engagement is still in process. So there it will depend on which data points that are already available in ClimateCamp or how long it takes suppliers to generate those. A primary example for beer, for example, we are together with, let's say, one of the breweries or malteries we work with is Boord Malt, who will have already available in ClimateCamp the product carbon footprint for their traditional malt, for their regenerative malt. So there, actually the emission factors will be available straight away. If it is within a different industry where maybe we do not have the PCFs yet, then we chase it with suppliers where it can take up to a month if they have the PCF to make sure that it's correctly uploaded and allocated in the PCF. So yeah, once the data is in ClimateCamp, a first PCF will be available within 2 weeks. If the data is not, if then of course still the process will need to start on gathering the PCFs from suppliers as well. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, Ruben. I'll go into the next question from Anissa. Is it possible to send an example of a questionnaire? It is indeed difficult to gather data from our suppliers. I'll answer the question in 2 manners. The first being in ClimateCamp, it's not necessarily a questionnaire. It's through the platform that people can indicate which data they want to share and then share it within the platform itself. And Ruben can show that while I'm talking. The other thing is, it doesn't really matter how good your questionnaire is or how pretty or how well structured it is. A lot of the work comes into the hand-holding, the outreach, the providing proper context and information. It doesn't matter if a person doesn't have time, he will skip the mail with the questionnaire, or if he doesn't understand what he needs to fill in, or doesn't have access to the data which you are requiring of him, of her, he will not answer the questionnaire. So it also takes a lot with regards to following up, providing proper context, and then setting meetings so you can explain what you require from them, which is a very time-intensive process.
So I'm just quickly, as it's indicated, I had the account open anyway. It's maybe not a demo account, including already uploaded data, but this gives a bit of a view on what data that is possible to receive in ClimateCamp. I see I'll need to put here, and as I saw that was the last question anyway, I think I can take a bit more time. On the product carbon footprint, some of the data points that are received, and you'll see that it's more than just a number. Actually, we will ask the validity or the period for which this PCF is available, indicate the unitary product amount, some of the details as well. So of course, the system boundaries are very important to request a description on these boundaries. If PCF includes packaging, exempted emissions, a description, is there any flag-related emissions, biogenic emissions, biogenic carbon content, and so on, can be indicated. The calculated standards, so you will see here that it's possible to indicate that, and if there is a level of assurance provided, and if so, by whom and which kind of level of assurance has been provided. As you can see, there's quite a lot of data points that are being requested. It depends a bit on the customer, on which data points they find valuable, but we always recommend to at least ask a level of assurance, at least ask the scope and the boundaries, and at least ask, if possible, to upload any kind of documentation to know if the carbon footprint is credible enough to leverage. Because of course, if you're going to use a product carbon footprint received from a supplier, it's very important it's correct, even if you use it as to change it for an emission factor in your corporate carbon footprint calculation, to make purchasing decisions, to see how you can modify your own products, or even as being a reseller to communicate the product carbon footprints you receive from your supplier to your customers directly. We think the data accuracy and correctness is very important, and there is many checks being done on our side as well to make sure that this data is usable for the purposes that is used. Just to be complete, usually we'll also ask our suppliers, or our customers also like to ask their suppliers if they set any reduction targets, if they are aligned with SBTi, if so, how is the alignment, what's the status, and then also the different the timeline that is connected to those, to upload those in ClimateCamp as well. Usually we see this for companies that have, for example, a supplier engagement target, where they need to put 67% of their value chain on emissions on SBTi as well. So these are some of the insights that we usually will gather from suppliers. Also, organizational footprint, I quickly showed it, indicating which scopes, if it's an absolute or relative or intensity-based emissions, if a scope is indicated, because sometimes you say scope 3 is indicated, but they only include a specific category. This is also something that we would be responding, if there is any validation being done, if so, by whom, and then of course some general information about sustainability contact details or sustainability reports. You will see that even before we reach out to the suppliers, our AI will already scrape the web to see if there is any publicly available sustainability reports, contact details, SBTi targets. So yeah, there's first an initial scraping being done from or the company is already on ClimateCamp and we have the data there. So we already have quite some companies on ClimateCamp which already have the data. If it's not there, we will first scrape the web to find any publicly displayed information. Then we will set up a call with usually an account manager. We will give the context. We'll show already which information we found. They can upload any information that they have available, and usually they will redirect us to a sustainability manager who will then fill in the last details, the PCF details. So go a level deeper to make sure we can assure that the PCFs that we receive or the targets we receive are correct and up to standards to be used. So I hope that's an answer to the question.
All right, thank you, Ruben. I think that was a very extensive answer to the question, and it is also necessary, as I alluded to before, even if you have a nicely designed questionnaire or platform, it's a lot of information to fill in. It needs a lot of context, even for people who understand the topic and have access to the data. It will take some time to fill in. Just merely sending a questionnaire often creates a lot of barriers for data entry. I want to thank everybody again for joining us for this webinar. I want to add one more caveat. I will be doing more of these in the future, trying to find other people, partners in the field who also want to talk about relative topics. I will mail all of you after this webinar, but I want you to think about the question, are there certain topics which you would like to learn more about? Is it corporate carbon footprint, product carbon footprint? Is it how to engage with suppliers? What do you need to do before you want to align with SBTi or other frameworks? How do you go about exchanging PCF data? What are best practices there? If you have an idea of this is a topic within carbon and carbon reduction, which I would like to learn more about, please do answer it here or do it on the mail. I would really be very grateful for the information. Now we can leave 15 minutes earlier than expected, so I hope everybody can enjoy the sun and the nice weather outside. I hope it's everywhere nice weather for the people in the call, and hopefully we'll see each other in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maarten.
Thanks a lot, Ruben. All right.